Kia ora koutou, kosu kutsaho. I work with the Zero Waste Network. The last few years, we've been hearing a lot of talk about how Aotearoa could or should shift to a circular economy. And what's becoming really obvious is that we all have different things in mind when we think about what that circular economy could look like. Just like sustainability, a circular economy can be used to justify almost all things to all people. It's really important that we get a shared understanding of what kinds of material flows define circularity before we get too far down the track. We've been doing some thinking about how reducing waste, reducing emissions, and circular economy fit together. I wanted to share that with you all as a way of keeping the conversation going about how we can use zero waste strategies to create a circular economy. As we all know, things are looking pretty grim. For the last 10,000 years, we've been living in a very safe and happy climate space. It's been perfect for humans to thrive. As you can see, the last 100,000 years on planet Earth have been a bit up and down, so our perfect Holocene bubble is a bit of a lucky break. Since we started burning fossil fuels to power the Industrial Revolution, we've been doing our best to push ourselves out of the 350 parts per million sweet spot. Adding carbon to the atmosphere has already got us to 415 parts per million, and we're steadily climbing. I saw a great summary of where we're at from one of the scientists that helped put together the 10,000 pages of evidence in the latest set of IPCC reports. It's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad. We can fix it if we get on top of emissions as soon as possible. The scientists say they're often accused of being too conservative, but they say it's the conservative response to their advice that's the real problem. Their evidence calls for a much more radical and rapid response. There's been a massive increase in the amount of raw materials that we put into our economy from the environment. In the 1970s, we took about 25 billion tonnes a year. In 2020, we drew out 100 billion tonnes of new raw materials to run our economy. The way we produce, consume, and dispose of products, materials, and energy has negative impacts up and downstream. Habitat destruction, biodiversity and topsoil loss, resource depletion, and water and land pollution. So we're busy burning through our capital stocks in the natural world, and our fossil fuel addiction is warming up our planet. Our nationally determined contributions are not going to keep us within 2 degrees of warming. To turn that around, we really have to radically transform the way we produce and consume. Just doing something won't be enough to save us from ourselves. To get there, we're going to have to pull every lever we have available to reduce material and energy consumption. We also have to get way better at sharing what we make and grow so we can reduce inequality across the board. You got to wonder if we're up for the challenge. If we look at the latest Kantar Better Futures 22 results, we can see that people really care about zero waste issues. There's 3 in the top 10 and they've all moved up the rankings. People are worried about the buildup of plastic in the environment, too much waste and rubbish being generated, over-packaging, non-recyclable packaging, and landfills. Personal commitment to living sustainably has gone up 24% in the last 10 years. People report feeling most empowered to make a difference on the issues that seem visible and ownable, so they take action to reduce waste and overconsumption and support local businesses. They donate or sell stuff instead of throwing it away. They say they're trying to avoid having to buy new stuff by repairing and maintaining things, buying secondhand, and hiring, borrowing, and sharing stuff. People are even starting to catch up on climate change. 50% are concerned about climate change, and less than half now think that our climate change problems are a long way off. 86% think households could do more to reduce emissions by changing their lifestyles, and more people want to see government leading the way. We're seeing a bustle of activity with government and business. The Climate Commission recommended an ambitious target for reducing methane emissions from organics to landfill, as well as taking a much stronger position on waste reduction. They also recognise circular economy as a powerful cross-cutting driver. The waste strategy flagged circular economy as the key goal for all resource efficiency and waste policy. MB is starting to make noises about circular economy and a bioeconomy strategy. And these are still sitting as separate thought bubbles, and it looks like it could be a while before they're integrated with mainstream thinking. There's even a strange variant of circular economy being advocated by the Infrastructure Commission, who have the mistaken idea that burning everything will get us to zero waste and enable a circular economy. We're slowly getting the idea that waste reduction is the key to reducing emissions and material flows, but some people are stuck on the idea that more recycling is going to be enough. Others think that reducing the methane emissions from landfill is the best our sector can do to reduce New Zealand's contribution to climate change. We all know that our linear economy isn't really working for us. But for most of us, the circular economy is something that's a hazy image out in the distance. Got a nice ring to it. We don't really have too much idea about how we're going to make it all happen. Actually, it's easy to dismiss it as a bit of a fantasy, but it's not really as hard as it looks. We just have to stop all those billions of tons of materials we've already brought into our economy from leaking back out again. If we stop burying and burning all the resources we've already extracted, we won't need to harvest so much from our environment to keep the economy going. That's got to be good for everyone. The economic value of ecosystem services is about 1.5 times global GDP. 90% of biodiversity loss and water stress is caused by extraction, pollution, and wasteful use of resources. The less damage we do, the easier it is for our planet to look after us and all the plants and animals we share it with. The guys from Circle Economy do an annual circularity gap report. They say that our global economy is about 8.9% circular at the moment. Yep, that makes it 91% linear. They say the good news is we only have to make it to 17% circular by 2032 to have a hope of staying inside 2 degrees of warming. To achieve that, we'll have to use 28% less materials and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 39%. How hard could it be? After all, waste and emissions are just forms of inefficiency that we need to eliminate from our economy. Circle Economy also created this X-ray of the global economy. It tells the story of how we combine materials and energy to meet our wants and needs. Blue shows fossil fuels that we burn for energy and turn into plastics. Purple and orange are the minerals and ores that we incorporate into all our stuff. Green is the biomass that we pull in through forestry and farming for food production and our construction industry. This X-ray diagram describes how we take and process raw materials to produce and provide the goods and services that we value. Looking at this complicated tangle helps me to understand that there is energy embodied in everything we make and use. And it shows why we have to collaborate across the whole life cycle to change the way that we produce and consume goods and services. Product stewardship is the framework we need to build value chains. It helps us to work together to shepherd materials and energy through the economy and to keep them going back around again. 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions are related to material handling and use. So in the UK, RAP has been working on the links between resource efficiency, waste, and emissions for many years. Their 2009 work helped kickstart circular economy thinking. They advocate for strategies like lifetime optimization, making things last longer, changing the way we consume, goods supplied as a service like a car share, and they also flag the value of action to reduce, reuse, repair, recycle, and compost to enable the shift to a restorative circular economy. Resource efficiency strategies like these mean people can still access goods and services with fewer of the negative impacts associated with linear production and consumption. Shifting to new ownership and delivery models means we can get the same use value with lower inputs through durability, right to repair, reuse, and sharing mechanisms. RAP's recent comparisons of the relative emissions reduction potential of a range of government policies for the UK's 3rd, 4th, and 5th carbon budgets shows that resource efficiency is a very handy tool to have in the toolbox. A big focus for emissions reduction policy is on using renewables to replace fossil fuels. The energy that we use to run our transport and buildings accounts for about 55% of our emissions. Ellen MacArthur Foundation's work found that 45% of the emissions are generated through industry, agriculture, and land use and the production of goods and food. Focusing on production and consumption helps us to zero in on how we could reduce these cross-cutting emissions. We can reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the value chain by eliminating waste. We can retain embodied energy by reusing products and recirculating materials. We can sequester carbon in soil and products to regenerate natural systems. Products like Fairphone are a good example of how this happens in real life. Fast-moving consumer goods used to be about food and grocery items, but nowadays it's the norm for fashion and electronics to have very short life cycles too. The Fairphone uses an old-fashioned model to put their products on the market. Their idea of value is to slow gadget throughput down as much as possible by making them simple, easy to fix, well supported with updates and spare parts. Giving their phones a long and happy life means all the upstream emissions that get generated every time a new phone comes into being are avoided, and replacing one small part means we don't have to waste all the other bits when something goes wrong. This diagram from Zero Waste Scotland shows where emissions are generated over the life cycle of our food and products. The 45% of emissions spotlighted by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation show up in extraction, production, warehousing, and retail. They're also created during the use phase. Transport emissions come in at every stage of the process. The 4% of waste emissions that show up in production-based accounting are only a tiny proportion of the emissions created across the product's life cycle. The production-based approach counts emissions produced in New Zealand. This is the method used to create our greenhouse gas inventory stats and to report on our targets and international commitments. When we use this lens, it seems like our sector has very little to contribute to the emissions reduction story. But a consumption emissions lens shines a light on how we can really make a difference. The consumption-based approach counts all the emissions consumed by New Zealanders. This is our carbon footprint. Some of these emissions are generated onshore, some are generated offshore, in the countries where we import our consumer goods from. Consumption emissions cut across sectors, and they give us another lens for thinking about how we can reduce our emissions. Zero Waste Scotland looked at the emissions embodied in different materials found in the average household rubbish bag. The top 5 were animal and food waste, plastic, paper and cardboard, textiles, and metals. Textiles are the darker blue. On the left, they're only 6% by weight, but on the right, they make up 34% of the carbon impact. This kind of analysis helps to pinpoint hotspots where a small amount of material reduction can have a big impact on our carbon footprint. The impact of over-consuming clothing and household linen looks bad enough when we see the piles that are arriving at second-hand shops every day. It gets a whole lot more scary when we factor in the carbon footprint. The cradle-to-cradle concept gives us a useful frame for thinking about how we could keep materials flowing around in our economy to create lower impact value chains. There's 2 key ideas. One, that it makes sense to keep renewable organic materials separate from technical materials. This makes it more straightforward to take them back around into new processes at the end of their useful life. And 2, that smaller loops require less energy to preserve the use value of the materials. This aligns really well with our waste hierarchy. It's the same old story we're all familiar with. Sharing, maintaining, and reusing take less energy and effort than remanufacturing and recycling. A lot of conversations that are happening at the moment, organics only show up as waste and methane emitters. We need to take a whole system approach to organics that sets them in context of ecosystems, soil health, and our food systems. Thinking about the bioeconomy in isolation from ecosystems and disconnecting the bioeconomy from the circular economy is unhelpful. All the same waste hierarchy rules apply to organics. Choosing not to extract biomass from our environment means trees and ecosystems can carry on sequestering carbon for us. Reducing food waste at source will give us 50 times more emissions reductions than we get by using the divert from landfill option at the bottom of the hierarchy. It's critical that wherever possible, we feed organics back into our soils so we can maintain soil health and fertility. Burning organic material is a last resort. It's a disposal strategy just like landfill. We need to work our way through all the other layers of the hierarchy before disposal options like burning or landfill are even considered. We've come to a fork in the road. Our waste hierarchy shows us what we need to prioritise to reduce consumption emissions. To create a zero carbon circular economy, we need to stop investing in new disposal strategies so we can put all our energy and resources into zero waste strategies like redesign, reuse, repair, composting and recycling. The best first step for us all is to change the language we use to talk about what we're up to. Managing waste describes the activities at the very bottom of the waste hierarchy. We need to stop using waste as a label to describe our sector and what we do. Once we make the turn towards circularity, the higher we can go up the hierarchy, the better. The biggest emissions reduction wins come from not creating unnecessary single-use stuff in the first place. As RAP in the UK have been telling us for years, if recycling is the answer, then we've got to be asking the wrong question. We don't have to figure it all out on our own. People all around the world are already making good progress. We just have to find the ones that know what they're talking about and become fast followers. Amsterdam's using a circular city approach to reduce its emissions profile. Their goal is to halve raw material flows into the city by 2030. They're zeroing in on 3 value chains: food and organics, consumer goods, and built environment. The strategy in the food and organics chain is to link organics flows with the primary industry and horticultural worlds, as well as food processing and distribution. The focus is on short supply chains, healthy, sustainable food, high-quality processing, and composting to return organics to soil and beneficial use. Taking a value chain perspective requires a different way of thinking about production and consumption that looks upstream and downstream. It creates a clear story about how materials and energy are used to deliver goods and services that people value. This kind of thinking is being used by RAP in the UK to understand where the best intervention points are in food systems to reduce emissions. This consumption emissions-based approach enables a deeper conversation about the upstream opportunities to reduce emissions and environmental harm, both onshore and offshore. It also takes some of the heat out of the sector-focused debate about who should be responsible for reducing our emissions. It's clear that agriculture, industry, warehousing, retail, transport, and consumers all have a role to play in shaving emissions out of the food system. Consumption-based approaches also acknowledge that the emissions embodied in imports contribute to the carbon footprint of the food system. None of this will come as a surprise to the businesses who are already working hard to reduce their Scope 3 emissions. These are all the indirect emissions that occur upstream and downstream. As much as 90% of a business's environmental footprint can occur outside their day-to-day activities. It's early days for this kind of thinking. Mostly, we're still stuck in a linear landscape. You can see that Cradle to Cradle hasn't made it onto the mental maps yet. It'll take a while for businesses to be able to join all the dots so they can collaborate right across supply, use, and recovery chains to get materials and all that energy embodied in them going back around again. Most businesses are small players, so they need a supportive framework to be able to work together to shape the zero waste and zero carbon value chains that we need to make the transition to a circular economy. To be able to shepherd materials and energy through our system in a better way, we need to radically expand the way we think about product stewardship. Effective product stewardship systems will enable us to work together to create the circular value chains. None of us can do it on our own. Everybody in the supply, use, recovery, and reprocessing parts of a product life cycle need to be coordinated if we want to get materials and products going around again and again and again. Then they'll travel from cradle to cradle instead of leaking out of our economy as waste, pollution, and emissions. We need cross-cutting tools and data sets to be able to make sense of how responsible our production and consumption systems actually are. Scotland has about the same population as Aotearoa, and over there they use 3 complementary tools to guide their decision-making and to track progress. Every year they analyse their materials flow, carbon footprint, and greenhouse gas emissions. Measuring the flow of materials through the economy shows its materials efficiency, and this can be related to GDP or population. Scotland's first material flow accounts established a baseline of about 18 tonne per person per year. A sustainable material flow is estimated to be about 8 tonnes per person a year. They've made a good start on tracking their progress towards this goal though. Aotearoa has been tracking greenhouse gas emissions for a while. New Zealand Stats has started to do carbon footprint analysis, and it would be great to see material flow analysis added to the list. And then we can start using all 3 to shape our policy and our decision making. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation have been working on circular economy stuff for ages. They've put together a handy framework for thinking about how to get a zero waste, zero carbon circular economy happening. 5 pieces of the puzzle need to be in place. On the supply side, we need to redesign systems, products, materials, and business models. On the recovery side, we need to build a viable and stable recovery chain. To enable this, we need to get the regulatory framework and the economic instruments in place to reshape the economic drivers. And we need to invest in innovation infrastructure and skills so we've got the hardware and the human software that we need to make it all work. Working effectively together lies at the heart of it all. By sharing knowledge and resources, we can create the circular systems that will shepherd materials and energy through our economies in ways that meet everybody's needs. I'm from the Zero Waste Network. For us, the circular economy is just a reframe of an old story. We've been using zero waste strategies to change our world since 1989. Our goal is to transform our community's relationships with materials, energy, each other, and our places. Zero carbon by 2050 is the emissions piece, to decarbonise and reduce consumption and landfill emissions. But this has to go hand in hand with zero waste by 2050, which is the materials piece, to limit resource consumption and slow down product and material flows. By doing both at the same time, we've got a fighting chance of building our circular economy.
Thank you, Sue. That was a great presentation. I like the analogy of the inefficiencies in moving from the linear or moving away from the linear system. Nice. First question for you. One of the panelists in a previous session today said we needed to make secondhand and repairing cool. How do you suggest we do this in the face of aggressive and slick marketing advertising from major brands?
Well, I think that you can see from the latest Better Futures report that people are actually starting to become a bit cynical about all that slick marketing. And we're seeing people really reporting, I think it's something like in the 60% anyway, of people saying they're into repairing and they want to be able to buy products that are able to be repaired. If you look around anywhere there's cool people at the moment, it's much cooler to be in secondhand and to have an old phone than it is to have the latest gadget. So I think that things like the Fairphone, they're really starting to become the cool thing to have rather than the sort of the dweeby thing to have. And if you look at organisations like Extreme Waste in Raglan or Wastebusters down south, then those places where there's been those organisations for 20 years just going, it's cool to care about your place, it's cool to care about your people, it's cool to think secondhand and to think about how we can share resources amongst one another, are really, they were based on the idea that it had to be cool and fun to come there. That was the whole story of the drive to get people in the door. And if you look at the work that Parakora is doing, having somebody who is able to speak to you in a way which really resonates in terms of your cultural experience and your life history is a very powerful way of getting people on board. And so I think that when we talk about behavior change, we're really talking about, connecting with people in the place, at home, and connecting with people in their communities, and having somebody who's really familiar to you telling you the story is what's going to get the traction.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yes, the it's good to look at the data. And as you say, the latest report from Kantar said, there's more people thinking in that space. So we need to duplicate the wonderful stuff happening in Raglan and Wanaka throughout the rest of the country. Another question for you. Given we account for onshore emissions, how do we balance that against contributing to offshore emissions, like plastic packaging manufacture, which is where recycling brings emissions to New Zealand?
Well, I think it's important to, like I was saying, there's different tools we can use, and they're basically different lenses which shine light on parts of the system. So we need to think about our production emissions, which are the ones that are the onshore ones, and we also need to look at our consumption emissions, which are, related to the demand New Zealand that New Zealanders create. And even though those emissions that are generated offshore may not be counted under our greenhouse gas inventory, relevant and relate specifically to our targets, they're still being generated as a consequence of demand that's created onshore. And so I think that it's part of our social responsibility as a global citizen. New Zealand's a rich country. We consume a lot, we import a lot, and it's a lot of the manufacturing countries offshore who are, kind of being shouldering the burden of having to face up to those emissions through their greenhouse gas emission inventories. And that's not a fair way of going about it. We really need to be doing essentially more than what it looks like we need to through our production emissions accounting.
And on a similar theme, you mentioned consumption emissions instead of production emissions. But does this mean that agricultural emissions would not be included in New Zealand's carbon footprint as Fonterra milk, for example, is consumed overseas? Does this make consumption analysis problematic?
No, I don't see that. I see it being them being complementary tools. You need to get a real picture of something in a three-dimensional way. You really need to look at, the emissions we generate onshore, the emissions that are generated as a consequence of our own demand, and also the materials footprint of the products that we have passing through our system. So it's not about either or. It's about both and. You really need to have all three, be looking at them and considering what the changes are. I think that example of textiles is a really good one. 6% of the weight, but it's 34% of the emissions consequences. And so, things are not always what they seem on the surface, and you need to have, different strategies for looking deeper into the puzzle.
That's a very good point. You need to use as I said before, data is important, and using both production and consumption at the same time, taking as you need. That's an important point. Someone has asked that if it's possible for you to provide your notes and where your key stats have come from in some form. I'm not sure.
I guess they just mean, where did the references come from for some of the graphs and stuff. So if anybody is interested in that, then just send me a mail and I'm happy to supply the info on that.
Cool. Here's a question I quite like. Do you think the target of 40% emissions reduction in the waste sector is achievable?
Yes, I do. We recommended that the Climate Commission extended their target, and they have done so. Wouldn't want to claim all the credit for that, but I think it's absolutely achievable, and it's just a matter of what we choose to invest in. We're seeing a lot of talk about investing in waste to energy strategies, and I think that's a shame because we really want to see money going into those top of the hierarchy diversion strategies, where we can start to shift material out much earlier in the system. And we know that we are heavily dependent on the quality of our soils and the fact that we carry on having some topsoil to keep on, primary production and horticulture. We've got to get that material going back around into the soil. It's it's a number one priority. We've got to make sure that we do the best job we can of getting it back into our soils and keeping ourselves able to keep on, producing the great products that people really value overseas.
Cool. That's an optimistic answer. I like that. So there were thoughts from the Climate Change Commission earlier around the waste to energy and the role it has to play in reducing our emissions reduction strategy and how it could potentially have negative impacts on the circular economy. I was just wondering, one of the questions is, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that Joe may have misunderstood the question a bit because the question was specifically about incineration. And I would say that incinerating rubbish has no place in our future path. It basically takes us in the wrong direction, absolutely. If we have, look at what's happening in Europe at the moment, that's the decision that's been made in Europe. Denmark, they're saying we're going to back away from incinerators because we're not able to meet our emissions reduction targets if we continue to do this, because we're emitting so much CO2 by burning, fossil fuel plastic and other, materials. So I think that, the leaders in the world are going in the opposite direction. I think we should too. I think that it becomes a bit more complicated when you start talking about single streams of materials, like someone was talking in the C&D session earlier about whether we can replace some of our process heat with some of the wood waste, products that we have. And I think those things need to be carefully thought through to make sure that there's not a better option higher up the waste hierarchy. But, we really need to, it's a lot more complex than it first seems. Now, there are maybe a few good ideas in the waste to energy pile. And there's, if you get to incineration, then that's something we should just put a big red cross through straight away.
That's interesting, and I tend to agree. And I was living in Hatfield in Hertfordshire in the United Kingdom, and someone was trying to build a waste to energy plant there. And just like landfills, the community was so up against it, and there were arms and protests and so on. Council eventually forced it through, but after I left, it got cancelled because of so much public opposition to it. So they're not particularly popular as well. Yeah, and I think this might be the last question. 80% of environmental impacts are embedded in the design phase. How do we fundamentally change this process? Does product stewardship go far enough?
Well, I think the way we think about product stewardship at the moment is pretty limited. We tend to be just looking at, product stewardship is if we put a charge to cover the cost of recycling or something like that. And what I would advocate for is, like, if we really want to create something like a value chain, that's the whole system, right from cradle to cradle. And for that to happen, we all have to work together effectively to shepherd products through the system and to get them going back around again. One person ill-conceived decision at one point can destroy the value of the material for everybody in the future. And so I think that the role of product stewardship is really to act as a coordinating mechanism to get everyone in the supply, use, recovery, and kind of renewal phases of the life cycle, working together to make sure that we don't have any of those materials leaking out. We've still got a way to go, but people are starting to have those conversations.